everyone, to the latest in our Ludgate Lecture series, so named after our former office in Ludgate Circus. We like continuity at Bright Blue. We're delighted this afternoon to welcome Professor Eric Kaufmann, who's very kindly agreed to join us to speak on what comes after woke. He's currently Professor of Politics and Director for the Centre of Heterodox Studies at the University of Buckingham. Originally from Canada, he completed his undergrad in Ontario before completing his master's and doctorates at the LSE, and then held positions at Southampton and Birkbeck. A prolific author and commentator, his books include 2018's Whiteshift, Immigration, Populism, and the Future of White Majorities, and more recently, Taboo, How Making Race Sacred Produced a Cultural Revolution. Just quickly before I hand over to Professor Kaufmann, quick note on the format. Eric will speak for around 20 minutes. That's not a hard and fast time frame. I'll then ask a few questions from the floor, and then we'll open it up to questions. Please feel free to submit questions via the Slido link, which you can find in the description on YouTube. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, Professor Kaufmann. And without further ado, I will hand over the reins to you.
Thank you, Will. It's an honor to be invited to give the Ludgate Lecture. I remember I've given the odd lecture to Bright Blue over the years. Always enjoyed the interaction. So yeah, I'm here to talk about developments really in the culture, and I'm going to move pretty quickly to just to share my screen, which I think I should be able to do soon, because I just want to sort of show you some slides. I tend to be a quantitative researcher, so I like to try and provide generalizable evidence for my claims. And so what I really want to look at here is the rise and fall, if you like, of, well, the question mark around the fall of woke and what this means. Okay, now it doesn't look like I'm able to share a screen, so I'm going to have to just go without slides, I suppose. All right, so the question then is one of, do we have a decline of woke? Are we post-woke, and what comes after it? So just very quickly, what woke is the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual minority groups. So it's about attachment to a particular set of groups and their narratives. So Indigenous, Black, for example, feminist narratives around women, and then gay, trans, etc. So it's very focused on these identity categories, but there's also a kind of broader sort of moral ideological agenda, which is equal outcomes by race, gender, sexuality. So for example, in the boardroom or in admittance to Harvard or in politics, equal outcomes, let's say by race and sex, that's what we might call equity or diversity or affirmative action. And then the I, which is inclusion or harm protection for minorities, which is essentially about protecting members of these totemic minority groups from not just physical, but emotional harm. So the emotional trauma, microaggressions, trigger warnings, a lot of these terms that you may have come across more recently. So equal outcomes, emotional harm protection for historically marginalized race, gender, sexual minority groups. That's what we're talking about. And that politics, of course, did a lot of good, or arguably the politics of certainly Black rights, women's rights, gay rights has certainly done a lot of good, but my argument is that these have overreached in a number of important ways as we move from sort of individual rights and individual equality to what's known as systemic arguments around systemic discrimination and systemic inequality, which are not grounded, in fact, in science, but stray very, very much into not only meta theory, but arguably conspiracy theory. So the more we've moved away from that sort of individual rights framework to the kind of systemic arguments around systemic inequality and discrimination, the more problematic this set of beliefs has become. And so what I want to ask then is, what's happened on this front? So the first thing I would say is, if you look at the data, you can certainly see, if we track mentions of terms like white supremacy, patriarchy, racism, for example, transphobia, you can see a sort of explosion in the use of these terms in mainstream liberal media, New York Times, for example, but also even the Times of London. You'll see a huge increase from the mid 2010s, coming to a peak 2021, 2022, and then actually declining quite sharply since 2021, 22. Same pattern we can see for left-wing cancellations and targetings of professors or other students. That peaks, it rises very sharply. It peaks around 2020, 21, the racial reckoning with George Floyd, and Me Too, and a number of these sorts of developments, and then comes down dramatically between 2021 and 2024. DEI, mentions of DEI in the United States, major corporations in earnings calls, drops off after 2022. So we have quite good evidence then of some things going on quite significantly that we can call post woke, at least in the culture. The term vibe shift, for example, which was coined by a youth culture analyst, Sean Monahan, kind of captures the spirit of what's occurred really since the peak of what Matthew Iglesias called the Great Awakening. And so we've seen, for example, again, those indicators, media content, cancellations, DEI. In the US, we've seen a drop off from that peak. And I would argue this represents, as Sean Monahan argues, a loss of movement energy. All movements have a difficulty in maintaining high intensity mobilization. There's been a drop off since 2021, 22. However, I think it's important to note that there are two elements to this movement. I mean, one is the movement in the culture, and there's no question that, as Matthew Iglesias argues, the woke movement is out of juice culturally. I think that's one manifestation in terms of mobilizing potential and intensity. But when it comes to the second aspect, which is bureaucratization and the routinization, I guess, of these ideas in bureaucracies, not only of the state, but in corporations, in the HR departments, organizations like universities and charities, much more tenacious, and only where they've been effectively scraped out or forced out by law do we really see the retreat of woke from bureaucracies. And that's really only occurred in the United States. Okay, we've got some sharing here, so I'm just gonna sort of flip over here to the slides and gonna move through quite quickly here. All right. So yeah, I just want to talk then about this question of what this means in a larger scope. So we've talked about these trends, the rise and fall. But I think this is quite significant in a much larger time frame. Michel Foucault, who has this term episteme, argues that there are certain periods in the high culture, Renaissance, classical, the modern episteme, where knowledge is produced and organized in a certain way. He sort of hinted that there was a kind of postmodern period that begins in the 60s. I would argue that we've come to the end of this moment in the high culture that begins in the 60s with the civil rights movement. And it kind of ends, I would argue, with the peak of the Great Awakening in the early 2020s. So that 60-year, almost unbroken surge of cultural progressivism, I would argue, has come to an end. And we can almost draw a line and turn the page, and we're into a new era, which I'll call the post-progressive era. And I want to explore the significance of that. Just to sort of recap what we mean by the progressive episteme, you can see changes, for example, in public opinion, something like, do you approve or disapprove of marriage between blacks and whites? That's kind of a straight line increase, liberalization, equalization. If we asked about women working outside the home, we would see a similar pattern. If we asked about, should we allow a homosexual to speak or to teach, we see the same increase from the 1970s. We also, however, see something quite interesting, which I think is that toleration for a racist to speak, which was rising from birth cohorts born in 1900 up until the baby boom generation born in the late 1940s. Once the baby boomers come of age, that is, this time series would pick them up in the 1960s. You then start to see lower toleration for a racist speaking, as distinct from a militarist, a leftist, a homosexual, communist, where all of those measures were becoming more tolerant over time. I think that's important. It connects the Great Awakening to earlier periods of left liberalization. And that's why I would argue that left liberalization, the overreach of left liberalization around race, gender, sexuality is responsible for the excesses of the Great Awakening. So cancel culture, for example. Um, the other thing we see, by the way, is so some attitudes we saw interracial marriage, for example, women working outside the home, they're all moving in a more liberal direction in that progressive direction. But other sets of attitudes, now once we move away from treatment of fellow citizens to rights across borders, so immigration attitudes, there we see just polarization by party. So in the US, white attitudes to immigration by 2012, you know, Democrats, white Republicans, pretty similar from the 90s into the early 2010s. And then when Trump comes along, there's this sudden polarization. 50 points difference between white Republicans and Democrats in their view of whether immigration should be restricted by 2016. So huge polarization. We see that in Britain too, by the way, more slowly. There wasn't much difference between Tory and Labour voters on whether there were too many immigrants through the 60s and 70s and 80s, and all the way through to the 2010s. And then we start to see this widening. It gets to 50 points US style polarization by the 2020s. Um, Other attitude series show this same polarizing dynamic, what we might call what's known as racial resentment, but really involves four different questions, such as this statement: Irish, Italian, and Jewish ethnicities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do the same without any special favors. Questions that essentially get at this idea of, um, you know, it's all about individuals overcoming barriers, and anybody can make it. Do you take that kind of individual-centered approach, or do you have this more systemic approach? Generations of slavery and discrimination create conditions that make it difficult for blacks to work their way out. Um, what we see is that it's the blue line for Democrats that starting in the 2010s with the Great Awakening, they start to move to the left on these questions around affirmative action and systemic discrimination, whereas the Republicans maintain a more individual-centered view that anybody can make it. Um, so we're starting to see the polarization, not just on immigration, but also on this question of whether systemic type discrimination really is what's holding back minorities in the US. A, a chart which just came out very recently from a paper, you may have seen it on X, shows that there's been an increase in polarization in issue attitudes. It's largely been driven by people on the left becoming more extreme in some ways. But actually, if you break down that extremism, it's mostly a post-2010s Great Awakening phenomenon. So the left has become more extreme on various issues, I would argue, touching on race, gender, sexuality. In the 2010s, that's broadened the distance between Republicans and Democratic voters. So it's the same process. In other words, we're not seeing progressives simply sweeping the field as they did on, gay rights, black rights, women's rights. What we're seeing is much more contestation, polarization. So this is not going to be some kind of easy cruise to victory. I just want to talk then about the vibe shift a little bit, which we're noticing post 2021. I mentioned that, in newspapers, something like the use of the term white supremacy on cable TV peaks 2021 and drops. We can see the trans phenomenon. I've done some work on this, has peaked in 2023. So we're seeing a kind of peaking of a lot of these things. This is the earnings calls mention of DEI peaking in 2021. This is cancellations by the left peaking in 2021. And but also we're starting to see some attitudes, kind of what you might call going in reverse, or progressives are losing in a way that they've never lost really in the past 60 years in public opinion. And this is a question from, in this country, should there be separate toilets for men and women or only gender neutral toilets? And I've just focused on the gender neutral and the separate toilets. looking only at 18 to 24-year-olds, the youngest members of society. In the sort of 2020-21 period, there wasn't that much difference between the share of young people saying there should be separate toilets and the share saying there should be gender-neutral toilets. After 2022, the share saying there should be separate male and female toilets increases a lot, and the share saying there should be gender-neutral toilets goes down somewhat. That's just one indication of the, the progressive left losing on the trans issue. Here's another way to look at it. Transgender women should be allowed or should not be allowed to take part in women's sporting events. Into 2020, the distance between those who said that they should, which is about almost 30%, and who said they should not, 50. It's 20 points difference. Not that great. But by the time we get to 2024, almost 80% of British respondents are saying that trans women should not be entering women's sporting events versus under 20%. So there's a big defeat for the trans activist movement. Same thing in US data. So that's very significant. We have not seen reversals of this type in the public opinion data for 60 years. Again, that's leading me towards the argument that something post-progressive is going on. We see this, the idea of the vibe shift, we see a number of important public figures on the left who are sort of backing away, not just Kamala Harris, who's trying to get elected in 2024, but even when Trump is elected, there just isn't the same resistance in 2024 that there was in 2016. The energy had gone out of that movement. A number of people remove pronouns, so AOC removes her pronouns. You've got even Ash Sarkar critiquing woke. So there's been an important shift then in the culture, in the high culture, which has also affected the left to some degree. I will say, however, as mentioned, that we can talk about the loss of cultural energy behind the movement, but it remains very important in bureaucracies. Now, in the US, that has been tackled by politics, but not outside the US. So in places like Australia, Canada, and Britain, DEI remains firmly in control of the ethos of bureaucracies. I now want to talk a little bit about the role of politics in changing culture. You've heard the phrase politics is downstream from culture, but is it also possible that culture can be changed by political action? I just used, by the way, the political action of decolonization, where countries in the ex-colonies were breaking away and becoming independent in the 50s and 60s. That inspires the ideas behind post-colonialism of Fanon or Edward Said. And likewise, I think we can point to some of the political developments, particularly in America, that are inspiring some cultural changes. So, for example, I just want to focus on what's happened in the post-woke era. I mean, we started to see some criticism of progressive illiberalism in outlets like Harper's, The Economist, New York Times in the height of the awakening, which starts to chip away at the sort of prestige and power of woke. We then get a series of events post the racial reckoning, including BLM riots, a wave of crime that leads to a lot of Black people being killed in cities, homelessness problems and drug use problems in West Coast progressive cities, illegal immigration becoming a problem that is increasingly visible, teen mental health crisis. All of these things are leading some senior left liberals to rethink their positions. So there's something intellectual is going on, but there's equally then a set of political activity where, for example, we see Glenn Youngkin flipping Virginia, which was a state that went 10 points for Biden, on the basis of critical race and gender ideology in schools. Ron DeSantis in Florida winning on this, enacting legislation and taking on Disney. We see a number of other red states enacting laws against critical race theory, ESG for corporations, and DEI. And then post October 7th, with the Senate hearings around where presidents of Harvard and Penn were hauled in and made to account for some of the sort of anti-Semitic protests that were taking place. And so all of this has kind of led to a change in incentives. So once you get Trump coming in place, once you get red state governors targeting DEI and ESG and critical race and gender ideology, that changes the incentives for presidents of universities, for example, or of corporations. So the rational self-interest component changes, and that weakens the case for woke. Meanwhile, the sort of social movement energy is starting to sap, which no longer can pressure the leaders of these organizations. So that weakens, again, the incentives to continue to push DEI and ESG. The net result of this is then that sort of centrist liberals are emboldened who may have felt that they couldn't say anything about BLM or couldn't say anything about trans are now emboldened to push back. So there's a permission structure that's been created by Trump and DeSantis and this political targeting of woke bureaucracies, which I think is quite important. And what's really interesting, actually, is that this political targeting leads to a rethink amongst centrist liberals, and it leads to policy change as well. Uh, More rethinking also of some of the consequences of woke policy. So the culture war is not just about the culture war. If you, for example, say that prisoners must match the racial makeup of the population, and if there are too many Black or Hispanic prisoners, we have to have decarceration. Similarly, with discipline in the classroom, that we have to stop disciplining children to the same extent because we don't want to have a disparate count by race of people being disciplined or incarcerated, then that's going to have knock-on effects in your ability to have civil order, to control crime, or even to control illegal immigration. So there are all these downstream effects of the woke capture of institutions. It also drives polarization. So we have a whole set of these new problems which are not amenable to progressive solutions. On the one hand, around declining social connectedness and loneliness, the decline of the family, birth rate collapse, youth mental health, decline of trust. So a whole suite of questions which are very difficult to address from certainly from a cultural left perspective. And then a set of problems which have been thrown up by the emphasis on equal outcomes and emotional harm protection for minority groups. So cancel culture, you can't talk about immigration because that might be seen as racist. So that then leads to populists coming in, polarization, crises of masculinity and femininity, urban disorder, paralysis in progressive organizations like NGOs, charities. Um, and also there's the beginnings, the very beginnings of a sort of what I would call post-progressive trend in the high culture. Places like academia, we're now starting to see, for example, literary scholars saying, maybe it's not a great idea to just talk about racism and sexism in Shakespeare and in other works of classic literature if we hope to attract students. Maybe we should understand them in their own terms. That trend is still small, but some intellectual green shoots are starting to occur. Uh, the Trump administration and red state administrations clamp down on DEI, interestingly, has not been resisted that strongly in universities. Actually, there's sort of quiet support. Some surveys, institutional neutrality, this idea that universities shouldn't take political positions, backed by 2 in 3 members of the Duke faculty. A survey at UC Berkeley found that a lot of staff members said, well, actually, the external critics of universities have a point. There's almost as though there's a permission structure has been created for skeptics of the Great Awakening and when this cultural revolution was roaring through universities, they felt they couldn't say anything, but now I think a lot of them think, yes, there is a point to combating DEI. Um, and there's over 140 universities that have now adopted institutional neutrality. Um, Last points I'm going to make in the time I have is to look at this question then of a new research agenda. So if we're in a post-progressive episteme or historical era, Foucault's argument around those who argue that we're in a postmodern era, that is starting in the 60s, they also said, well, we need a new research agenda called postmodernism, which is a new way of looking at the world, and it's much more relativistic, focusing on social construction. What if we're in not a sort of postmodern period, but a post-progressive period? One of the arguments is this new period means we need a new set of tools, a new way of looking at the world. I wrote an article that was published in Theory and Society last year on this, we held a conference in June of this year at the University of Buckingham on this whole question of post-progressivism. And one tool which I've argued has some purchase is to try and use the tools of the social constructivists and postmodernists and critical theorists against the critical theorists or the woke movement itself, to say we can use these tools to interrogate the interrogators, and that can yield some insights. And so I talked about this in my Theory and Society piece. If you look at the work of Jacques Derrida, who's a prominent postmodernist, I mean, he argues that all categories are social constructs that are underlain by a power structure. Now, I don't buy into that. There's some degree to which that's true, but I think it's vastly overstated. But nevertheless, let's just follow Derrida for a minute. So in each of these pairings, white, non-white, male, female, heterosexual, homosexual, cisgender, transgender, there is, Derrida, I would say, a dominant group which is oppressing the other one, and using an ideology which legitimates both the categorization and the oppression. So in this case, we would have, if you look on the far left here, white would be the dominant group in this pairing, the dominant category, which would use the legitimating ideology of racism in order to maintain a white domination over non-white and to maintain this category. Similarly with sexism and so on. Now, my argument would be that we could actually take this analysis and use it to analyze, I think what we can argue is a new kind of, instead of identity discrimination, a kind of political discrimination. So we can now look at the category racist and anti-racist. And using Derrida's analysis, the anti-racist would be the dominant category in that relationship, or the anti-sexist or the anti-transphobe is dominant over the transphobe. So the subaltern category of, let's say, racist is being oppressed, if you like, by the anti-racist through a legitimating ideology, which is anti-whiteness. So the anti-racist manufactures this ideology which justifies categorizing people into racists and anti-racists. Now, the point of this is that the actual content of who is a racist is completely fungible and completely constructed. Now, I'm not saying I believe that. I think there are real racists and there are real anti-racists, but there is some truth to the idea that these categories are flexible and fungible and constructed ideologically. And so you might think of, under the old dispensation, this cultural conservatism underlying all of these categories, and likewise cultural socialism or wokeness underlying these discourses, such as anti-whiteness, which are perpetuating the categorization of some people as racists. One thing I think we need to do in the post-progressive era, looking at this kind of scholarship, is to try and look at empirical evidence for our claims. And so one of the phenomena that I look at is this idea of racism or white supremacy as socially constructed rather than real in many cases. So if you look here at white American opinion on this question, how big a problem is racism? The share saying it's a big problem among white Democrats, or sorry, white liberals, more or less doubles between the early 2010s and 2020. At a time when all sort of concrete indicators, interracial marriage, friendship, etc., are really moving in the other direction. And it's really difficult to see this as anything other than a social construction or even a moral panic that arises through some kind of deliberate discourse. We saw that with the spike in the media and the use of these terms. That's an example, I think, of the social construction of racism for ideological reasons. So this is using a kind of metacritical analysis on progressivism itself, which of course doesn't want to be analyzed, wants to elude categorization, wants to escape being even named, doesn't want to be analyzed, tries to naturalize itself as just what it means to be a good person, a moral individual. But of course, as Antonio Gramsci would argue, that is exactly what hegemonic ideologies do. They don't want to be seen as political, they want to be seen as natural. And that is a sort of cultural strategy rather than a law of nature. Okay, I'm going to end it there and happy to take your questions.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that, for that fascinating overview. I'm going to sort of ask a few questions of my own to start with. I
Sure.
guess it's hard to, you mentioned the sort of the Great Awakening. The height of it was around 2020, 2021. I guess sort of obviously there was that was the height of the COVID pandemic. How much do you think COVID was really driving the sort of the peak awakening? And do you think it, in some ways, by pushing it so far, so fast, helped accelerate its longer term decline?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I guess my general view is that it was not a major factor. If we look at, for example, the mention of terms like racism, sexism, white supremacy, and so on, in the press, those are already rising in the mid 2010s. Um, and really, there's kind of an acceleration after Trump comes on the scene to some degree, but it's not obvious that the pandemic itself really accelerates. I mean, the trend lines were already set in train before the pandemic hits. Um, but of course, yeah, I mean, the pandemic has interesting effects, right? I mean, you could make the argument that it might have been responsible for some of the reversal, the post-progressive reversal, because maybe parents could see what children were being taught in school, and that maybe shocked them and maybe allowed for this new politics of anti-woke to emerge. But equally, even if we take something like the teen mental health crisis, it was already well in train prior to the pandemic, but yes, the pandemic accelerates it. So yeah, while it's a factor, I don't think, I guess I tend to have this view almost of woke as a kind of sort of a form of ideological COVID, a sort of a strain of left liberalism that really sort of becomes virulent and has its own momentum, its own logic that has to unfold until it's met by a challenge. And so I'm kind of a culturalist, I suppose, in that sense, rather than taking the view that really this is affected too much by the material conditions.
And I guess also sort of following on from the culture being downstream of politics, is it also, it's also, you also talk about bureaucratic resistance. Isn't there also an issue that, particularly say in academia, it's harder to attract more conservative voices into academia to begin with. So obviously the sort of the moderates may now feel slightly more empowered to speak, but the sort of the more ideologically committed on the left are more likely to go into the institutions than that do shape opinion longer term than those on the right. How is that an issue, and how do you think we need to attract a more balanced intake into the academic profession?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, I think it's worth saying the connection between, let's say, progressive extremism and the makeup of an organization is also important to just mention, which is that there have been studies that show when an institution is a monoculture, that is where there's very little viewpoint diversity, under those conditions, the incentives change and the incentives favor fundamentalism, exemplifying the values of the entire community. John Ellis, in his book, The Breakdown of Higher Education, talks about this. Cass Sunstein does as well. So because you have a monoculture, that leads to extremism being expressed to some degree. Now, how does that academic monoculture develop? I think there's kind of like a greenhouse effect where um, what happens is you start to get a hostile environment when, let's say, people on the left become a majority. The environment starts to be coded left, which is a bit off-putting to someone who's conservative, so they steer away. It's a bit like maybe men steer away from nursing because it's seen as female coded. That starts to happen as you get this typing, and then that the more that men steer away or that conservatives steer away from the academy, the more progressive it gets, which intensifies the greenhouse effect of this progressive hostility. Now, that's not the only thing going on, but it's certainly one of the factors. The other is this sort of moralization of the left. Now, I think that's been going on for quite a while. It's probably become more intense as race and gender and sexuality have become the key touchstones of the left. The long and the short of it is, if you look at academia in the mid 1960s, there were many departments, agriculture, engineering, where Republicans were exceeded. There were more Republicans than Democrats. Uh, it was around, on average, in the social sciences, 3-to-1 left to right in the mid-60s from US studies and even from one UK study. That 3-to-1 has turned into about a 14-to-1 now. So there's definitely, yes, academia in certain disciplines always leaned left, but not as
Hmm.
much as today. Um, what can we do about it? I can go into that in more depth if you want, because I think there are innovative things that are happening now.
Yeah, I guess sort of very quickly on that. I mean, do you sort of then need to sort of fund research topics that, that might be of more interest to attract those on the right or center right to sort of entice them in, or what sort of strategies do you think could be put in
Yeah, I
place to
think
do that?
that's so the first thing to say is there's a couple of things that can be done. I mean, one is we need to make it as unacceptable to engage in political discrimination as to engage in race or sex discrimination. Political discrimination is perfectly acceptable in job talks. I've heard, been witnessed this on numerous occasions to say, oh, this person sounds a bit conservative. He sounds, that's acceptable. So that there needs to be a clampdown on political discrimination. There needs to be, penalizing of that. But in addition, and in fact, we know that sort of 45% of US and Canadian academics wouldn't hire a known Trump supporter for a job. In the UK, 1 in 3 academics wouldn't hire a known Brexit supporter. So there's quite a bit of this
Hmm.
political discrimination, which affects hiring, promotion, publishing, grants, everything. The second thing is, as you say, I think we do need grant programs that are targeting these subjects that have basically been sidelined. Because progressive control, they control the research agenda. They say, well, we don't need someone studying military history. That's old. That's what the dead white males do, or studying perhaps the classics. So yeah, I think advertising research positions, funding research centers that pursue this kind of unfashionable or cancelable, quite frankly, scholarship will be necessary. And there may be some initiatives afoot in the US. Watch this space on this. I can't say for sure, but I think there is thinking around this. Um, you can see it with these new civics institutes in the US where they are. Now, that's more teaching focused, or the University of Austin's more teaching focused, but they're clearly emphasizing traditional humanities, great books, and so on. But I think what's also needed is something around research funding to incentivize the topics that have been sidelined, which has actually skewed the entire production of knowledge in the academy away from reality, away from simply describing the world and investigating the world. It's you can investigate the world as long as you stay on the piste and you don't go off and cross this red line or that red line. So the whole idea of what scholarship is gets warped. One example of that might be, papers that find that there is discrimination against women in academic hiring or publishing are cited, many, 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 many more times than those papers that find that in fact there's no discrimination or there's the reverse and don't trumpet that. Typically, those they would put that in the footnotes. But those kinds of things are just not known about. So there's the whole kind of distortion of what is true that takes place in academia.
Cool. So moving on, we've got a few questions trickling through.
Yeah.
An anonymous one, and I might build on this a bit. Do you think the woke right is a real phenomenon? And I guess you are sort of seeing that some of the arguments that were associated with traditional, one argument is that the left sort of made it acceptable to make ideas that everything centers around identity sort of acceptable. So then some on the right, and you are starting to see a bit of on the nativist right on X and a few other places, sort of trying to emphasize whether it be sort of white British identity, and also, say on Israel Palestine, the revocation of visas for people who take a sort of pro-Palestine stance. Are you seeing basically a reverse of the
Yeah.
woke right on the
Yeah.
left?
I mean, this is quite a tricky one because there's this concept of family resemblance. Like, let's just say you have two phenomena. I use this example of a bat and a bird. They're
Mm,
both kind of small, they both fly, but actually, a bat is not a kind of bird because it doesn't check all of the boxes. And so I think in many cases, we have a family resemblance, focus on identity and identity narratives, cancellation, grievance, the whole bunch of these characteristics which are similar between certain right-wing movements or groups and the woke left. What I would argue, I mean, I think we have this debate too with fascism, is Donald Trump a fascist? So I think that certainly there are family resemblances, but I wouldn't call, there were only certain things I would call woke right. So for example, when Charlie Kirk was assassinated and you had people who were saying irreverent things about Kirk and saying, oh, he was, hateful or whatever. And then the calls to cancel him, because this is really enforcing a moral. The claim there is that you are a bad person if you say something nasty about Charlie Kirk after he's died, and therefore you must be canceled. That I would classify as woke right. But somebody saying, well, if you don't believe the 2020 election was stolen, you can't be a Republican and we're going to purge you from the party or from what we consider conservatism. I mean, yes, that's cancel culture. Yes, that's tribal, but I don't classify that as woke right because it's saying you're a bad Republican. It's not saying you're a bad person that must, therefore, we can't go near you. You're radioactive. You can't be banked. You know, I think there's a difference between saying someone's a bad member of the tribe and saying someone is bad and rotten to their core morally. That's what woke does. And I think you rarely see that on the right, except in a few instances, one of which is the Charlie Kirk case. So that I think does qualify. But for the most part, I think just so you need white identity or any of these things, I don't think that's actually what woke is about. Woke is not just about identity. It's about a religious, quasi-religious morality and purity test. So, for example, woke doesn't say you're a woman, so you should be a tribal woman. It says, well, you can assert your feminism against a man, but if a trans woman comes along, you got to step back and they get what they want against you. So you're in a pecking order. It's not just about tribalism, it's about kind of a religious pecking order.
Cool. Question from Graham Wright. Do you think that late millennials or early Gen Zs, I'm in Britain, I refuse to say Z, um, are more woke?
Um, Boy, that's a really tough one. I mean, because part of the problem is we can't easily prize apart age and generation in a lot of the data we have. Um, I would say it's certainly in the student data, the elite student data. I mean, it certainly looks as if the two are pretty similar. Um, there's not much difference. But when we some of the data sets where we look at people who are maybe further down, not going to elite universities or who don't have a degree, there does seem to be some indication that Gen Z are a little bit less woke on average. But that's a very difficult one to be 100% sure of. Some surveys will show you that, like Gen Z, they really don't like cancel culture, whereas the young millennials are much more pro cancel culture. But that's the odd stray survey. So yeah, I'm not giving a clear answer. I'm just not sure there's a huge difference. But what I would say is that young people are much less tolerant of free speech. They are much more woke. Now, I've just generalized, but actually, the truth of the matter is we're actually seeing polarization. So if you take young people like Gen Z, they're actually much more polarized than older generations. Yeah, older generations might say, no, J.K. Rowling shouldn't be dropped by her publisher overwhelmingly. But among the young, you will get very strong anti-woke people, who are very much hate woke, and you'll get very woke people. The spread of views is wider, the passions are greater, and I think what we're seeing is this polarization. There are differences by country.
Hmm.
Britain, young people in Britain are really left wing and more woke. Young people in Canada are actually relatively not very left wing, especially if you consider their elders. They are to the right of their elders, whereas in Britain it's the reverse. So there are differences by country which have to do with the political experiences, recent political history. But yeah, the other thing I would say is that we have to watch out because in 20 years, the Gen Z will start to be assuming positions of power and median voters, and if they carry their hostility to free speech into office, into leadership, then we are going to see a big threat to the classical liberal order. Yeah.
Can we, I guess, is there any hope in looking at past data on this? I mean, can we look at, say, how boomers or Gen X's attitudes were to these issues at a similar age versus what it is today? Does that give us any hope for Gen Z, or are we in a world of trouble?
Um, I don't think it does. I'll just give you an example. In 2016, there was a survey done in Smith College in the US, which is a liberal arts school, in the year 2000. Same questions were asked in 2016. The opinion of the 18-year-olds, so it's still comparing 18-year-olds to 18-year-olds, just 16 years apart, had really shifted away from this idea that you can say what you want even if it offends. Instead, it was much more around protection from speech. So I worry that, in fact, this is new. If you look at now, there are certain, it is true that if we look at, say, allowing a racist to speak in public, already baby boomers were starting to turn against that. So on that question, on some questions, there's been this progression over time. But don't forget that, with less toleration of that has come political correctness, which was well before the Gen Z. So yeah, I don't know. I'm concerned that I'm just not convinced that they'll grow out of it. What I think might, however, happen is if there's a big shift in the culture overall, that'll sweep across generations. Just like with gay rights, for example,
Hmm.
even older people who'd grown up with different attitudes eventually kind of came around to that. Likewise, if the elite culture, the high culture, really turns against cancel culture, really turns against woke, then that will encompass the young people as well. We see that a bit on the trans issue, where even amongst Gen Z, Gen Z, there isn't support for the trans activist agenda. And so, yeah, so
Is
that's kind of where we are. We need a big culture shift to wipe out the cohort change.
I guess sort of on the sort of the like say the anti-trans sort of thing. I mean, is there a danger that say as part of the anti-trans backlash, some of the more quote unquote traditional LGB rights might sort of come under be sort of a seen as part of the old or the woke, the discredited progressive orthodoxy and potentially endangered. Like I see in polls in the states, support for gay marriage is now really high among Democrats. It's come down slightly among Republicans in recent years.
I mean, you may get some of that. I guess well, we'll see, but I'm not convinced that the trans issue is that, that it's just simply amalgamated in with the gay rights issue. I think there is people, for the most part, can draw that
Hmm.
distinction. And even with the trans issue, I think people can probably, draw a distinction between saying, trans should have rights and shouldn't be, discriminated against, but at the same time, we have to keep women's spaces for women, for example. I mean, so I do think people can draw those nuanced conclusions. I don't think we're necessary, this idea, which is often held by progressive extremists, that if we give an inch on any of these issues, we're going to be back to women in the closet, gays in the closet, women in the home, and so on. I just don't buy it. I think you can step away from the extremes back to a optimum position. But note, if you really do believe in that this is the direction of history, is always moving in a kind of quote unquote progressive, i.e., equal outcomes, emotional harm protection, that's the future, then it's very hard to give up even one strand. And so we see the Democratic Party, for example, cannot let go of the trans agenda. It's not possible because if you pull that strand out and admit defeat, then the sort of thousand-year reign of Christ on earth kind of belief mission, this kind of millenarian belief system collapses. And so that's why, even though electorally it's suicide, you're seeing even those early, the Seth Moultons and other Democrat politicians who said, this issue's killing us. We got to get away from this. They've all been knocked back into line. And so it's very difficult intellectually to just let go of one thing, even if it's super unpopular.
That sort of quasi-religious approach to these
Yeah.
things. I certainly hope you're right.
Thanks.
Question from Diana Evans. I guess with the UK party system now splintered into into multiple pieces, which political party would you describe as the most woke, and do you think that has affected their popularity in any way?
Well, the Greens are obviously the most woke. I think there's no question about that. I think then after that, the Liberal Democrats and then Labour would actually kind of be less woke than either of those parties. I mean, you see, I suppose the trans issue would really be the litmus test for that. You don't see really Ed Davey backing away in a serious way from that. Um, so yeah, I think that's sort of where we are now. The thing is, unless the opposing party makes it an issue. It became impossible for Keir Starmer to say trans women are women, for example. The positions that they had held, they abandoned. You know, we saw in Scotland with Nicola Sturgeon and with Leo Varadkar in Ireland that, hanging on to the trans activist position did cost them. So I think that, but of course, it's down to the parties of the right, especially, to elevate the salience of these issues. The left is going to try and say, "Oh, you're being divisive," and that's terrible, because their aim is really to hide these issues. They're unpopular. We know from the survey data, it's about 2 to 1 against the woke position on average. Saying that Winston Churchill was a racist, these kinds of things are unpopular. So what the left will try to do is kind of hide them and just allow, if you like, the shock troops in the institutions, in the blob, in the civil service, in schools, universities, to run these policies, and therefore the hands of a left-wing government, for example, are clean, and they can disclaim. The job of the right really is to raise the salience and put the other party on the spot and essentially rake them over the coals, make them pay for holding these unpopular positions. And to the extent the right is able to do that, then this could decide elections, like we saw in 2024 with the they them commercial in the US.
Doesn't that, I mean, because you could sort of argue, and maybe it was because the Conservative
Yeah.
government had one or two other problems sort of by the end, but they would often, you'd see a trend on the right, you'd raise a lot of these issues, they'd make a big noise about them in government, but in terms of actually dismantling a lot of these programs, much less action was done. Is it almost that, would the right almost be better off learning from the left in that, as Bridget Phillipson has done with schools, not really make any announcements that you're going to move in a particular direction or just set a general vibe. And then when you're in government, just quietly set about dismantling these things, lowering the temperature and achieving the same effect.
Yeah, I think that I think you kind of need both in a way, because you do need to talk about them because that affects the culture, but you equally need to sort of act politically. And that's where I think really what it revealed was that the Tory party wasn't serious for the most part. They did a few things, retain and explain, but they didn't follow through. For example, political indoctrination in schools, Nadine Zahawi basically issued very baggy guidance. Largely, I think they rolled over to the education establishment. So it's going to take a much more determined DeSantis style politics. You need a party that really cares about culture. I'm not convinced the Tories did. Maybe that's changed, or maybe it was certain factions did, but I don't think the center of the party did. So I think that will have to change in order to sort of remove the bureaucracy that is more or less perpetuating this ethos across institutions.
I guess sort of following up from the sort of the left hiding its often hiding its sort of ideas, and I guess it's interesting the alliance between sort of say Muslim communities and sort of the progressive left within the Greens. Do you think the Greens are doing partly so well because they're hiding these issues, or it's a marriage of convenience, or they've just hoovered up that corner of the market that really is are the hardcore believers in a lot of the woke stuff?
Well, I think that a lot of voters, I mean, these things can be a bit remote for some voters. I think certainly the Greens have hoovered up that vote to a great degree. But I also think that a lot of voters are not fully aware of what Polanski stands for in terms of, say, men and women's sports, for example. In a debate, of course, if the debate is held by a progressive channel like the BBC, they may not allow a question like this. They may not allow this to be discussed because they are also on the side of those who want to keep these issues away. So you would need to have a TV debate, but ideally what you would do is you put Polanski on the spot and make him defend his ideas, and that would be a way in which he would have to pay the full cost of holding, whether it be open borders or whether it be, trans women in women's sports or whatever. It's going to take that kind of action to really bring out. But yes, I think there's no question that the Greens are occupying that space the most. But so the Lib Dems, and they, I think, haven't been called out. And I don't think a lot of their voters quite realize how radical they are.
Hmm. I mean, I guess the Lib Dems sometimes do have different positions to different audiences.
Yeah.
Yeah, sort of, I guess an anonymous question. How do we know an issue is progressive and what isn't? What defines a quote unquote progressive issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's basically equal outcomes and emotional harm protection for historically marginalized identity groups. I mean, that is basically what we're talking about. So it's a centering of race, gender, and sexuality. It's we're not just going to have the pride flag waved one day. We're going to have it for a month or a year, and it's going to dominate. Yeah, so it's a centering of those left-coded symbols. That's how we know it's there. And people who say, "Oh, this is just culture war, it doesn't matter." I mean, that's sort of what the left wants you to believe. But actually, this stuff, the cultural symbolism underpins the values, underpins the society. I always say if we replaced every Union Jack on every public building with a Chinese flag and say, oh yeah, but everything's going the same as it was before. Everybody's doing everything they did before materially. So it doesn't matter. We just changed a flag. But these things do matter because they underpin the ethos, which underpins the whole way of life. And so actually these are extremely important issues.
I guess I'll just ask one more question because
Yeah.
we sort of started a few minutes late, so I'll go slightly
Okay.
over time. Um, I guess particularly looking to the future in the States, and obviously that sort of culture being downstream of politics, it's certainly looking likely based on the current polls that the Democrats are going to do very well in next year's midterms, and also from special elections and the rest of it. And this is largely because Donald Trump is unpopular rather than because the Democrats have done anything amazing. If they're able to continue getting back into office effectively, every 4 to 8 years, simply by virtue of the other side being very unpopular, doesn't that really remove any incentive for them to get rid of these ideas? And doesn't that mean that there's always effectively a political, woke will always have some political supporters and it will retain at least some salience through the cultural institutions?
Yeah, I think that to the extent they can keep their unpopular issues in the shade and win on their popular issues, they can come into office and try and by stealth implement the same policies they implemented before. And I think you see some of this in Virginia with Spanberger and some of the bills that have been introduced there by the Democratic legislature. So yeah, and in a way that's not a bad thing. I mean, I think it's good if these ideas, okay, people know if you're going to vote for the Democrats, you're going to get DEI, you're going to get affirmative action, you're going to get, diversity state, whatever it is. People then know, okay, this is what we expect, and they're voting for it in full knowledge with their eyes wide open. That's democracy. And if the party that gets the most votes implements what they said they implement, you can't really complain. Now, I guess the question is how much will their unpopular positions hurt them? And you saw Donald Trump back away from unpopular positions on abortion, for example. Uh, and so maybe the way the system will work is if the Democrats keep losing, or it might just be they're losing 1 or 2 points, which is enough to shift a lot of races. This eventually leads to a kind of rethink or moderation. I mean, that's kind of the hope, as with the Republicans on abortion. And now maybe I happen to think that probably woke is too close to the sort of DNA of what it means to be a democratic activist. It's going to be very difficult for them to back away because since they know they're on the right side of history, uh, it may cost them multiple races. And of course, they're not always going to have a Donald Trump who arguably has a lot of negatives in a way that maybe a future Republican candidate may not. I mean, we can argue this different ways, but it may be quite fortuitous for them that they have Trump in there. They may not have that again, and so it may be that this really comes to hurt them in subsequent cycles. But yeah, I mean, clearly, if they do get in, the midterms, as it looks likely, I mean, they'll be able to at least slow down certain aspects of the Republican agenda. And if they win in 2028, absolutely.
Cool. Well, on that note, thanks so much for joining us once again. I found that fascinating. I'm sure everyone who was listening did as well. And yeah, do keep in touch. For those who are watching, like, do keep an eye out for our next Ludgate lecture, which will be announced in due course. Professor Kaufmann, thank you so much.
Thanks, Will. Thanks a lot. All right. Good. I hope that was reasonable.